Thank you all so much. I'm going to stand over here. And if it gets too exciting watching me wobble around, just hold your heart and over your hand over your heart, and I'll know to just hold on with both hands. It can be very exciting when it's, is she going for the bush? But I think we have to pause before I begin to talk to you and give Kim another hand. When a student goes through a complicated and dense academic program and has time and spirit to devote to the school she's involved with and her fellow students and doing work with the community and also do work around the country, that's a very special person who's going to make America a very special place. So thanks to Kim. That's the first hurrah on the other side of the last hurrah. So I'm so thrilled to be here with all of you because you're all people who share with me and millions of other Americans a common history, a common set of forefathers and foremothers, and a common dedication to making this country what it was always intended to be. And we do that in a country that is uniquely unlike any other nation in the world. As many of you know, because many of our great thinkers have already said it, we live in the only nation founded on a creed. And just the way many of us as Christians say during part of our service, I believe. The United States was formed in that kind of a context of what a set of people believed in about humanity. And for the first time on the planet, a nation was set up to express those beliefs among the people over time. And we don't think about that often enough. It feels like, you know, there's an economy and there's a this and a that and we have to do these things and we have nations, foreign trade and all. And you can get all embroiled in all the stuff that's terribly important and we all have to do it. Just like in philanthropy, you have to do strategic plans and write mission statements and theories of change and give me a break, all critically important stuff. But it's not at the core of why we do what we're doing. And why we do it is because I believe, because we believe. And it's easier, even for those of us who are focused on the great ideas and actual public service, it's easier for us to forget because we are down in the trenches actually making change, which of course is what's crucial. And you have to be well organized and well financed and have all your resources set up, but you can't let all of that work make you forget the fire. And the fire comes from the statements around what we believe. And as Americans, we believe in founding words of a document that framed the nation, the Declaration of Independence. And if you could do one thing in this coming year, for most of us, different from what we always do, start meetings with words from that document, because it'll change the way people hear you. You'll hear analyses of how bad the market is and how weak endowments are and how people are worried about giving and it's not going to go back to the way it used to be until... None of that is at the core of what we believe. That's just the current stuff we always have to deal with. Like in the olden days, we had to deal with a case of mumps. We don't deal with that anymore. We deal with other stuff. But there's always stuff. You have to hold on to what you believe. So hear me in that context, because America is in a crucial moment now. The world is changing fast all around us. What we've always wanted to happen, at least since the Marshall Plan, if not before, is actually happening all over the world. There's an increasing and scary kind of democracy and an urge for personal human dignity emerging all over the place. And people are telling us that we're going down instead of understanding the joyful recognition of the rise of the rest. It's not the fall of the West or the fall of America, but the rise of the rest. Thank God, that's what we were looking for. Or we would have left Japan and Europe in the state they were both in after the Second World War. We bought and paid for what's happening now. But I want to talk to you in a particular way because of my field and your interests and our wonderful students here today, about the nonprofit, or what I call the social profit sector, because this is where the I believe is expressed in America. It's expressed, of course, in corporate America and in government America and all of that, but the core of the fire is sustained in the social profit sector. And let me just take a moment to muse on that with you. I believe that in America, we are not generous because we're rich. We got rich and are rich because of our generosity. Get that? We're not generous because we're rich. You know, we give because we've got the money. We are wealthy as a nation because of our history of generosity. The founders wrote those words, and they knew darn well that those words weren't reality at the time they wrote them. They wrote them in what I like to call God's time. Looking across all human time, they pronounced certain things. All men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, among these to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And the rest of the document. But those things weren't real-life experience for everyone. They were real-life experience for a small number of people. But they were recognized philosophically to be where everybody ought to be. And they changed us from being subjects of a king, each of us with a personal relationship to a monarch who could do anything to us, and we'd have to live with it, because what are you going to call the army to tell on the king? And what happens then? Worse things happen to you. So each family has an individual and person relationship to a king. That's called being a subject. That document turned Americans into citizens, and citizens have a primary relationship to each other. So you and I today, and for most of us in this room, our fathers or our grandfathers went to war and risked and often sacrificed their lives in order to defend the beliefs of this country, of fellow citizens. They were willing to die for our right to a free press, to free speech, to freedom of assembly, and the rest of what we believe as people endowed with the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And had Nazism conquered, we not only would be speaking German, but we would be living very differently. And our forefathers and the foremothers made the sacrifices to give us the right to be citizens, and all of us, therefore, to stand in a position to defend each other's rights. So my rights are dependent on your willingness to rise up and defend me if I'm the one that's being dealt with unjustly. And we have spread those values around the world, but they are unique values to citizenship. And if I may say so, in these hallowed halls of public service and attached to the great Clinton name, I would say that being able to vote is not the primary step that a democracy should take. It seems it would be, but if you don't have a civil society, people are still thinking like subjects and voting, and crazy mad things happen. And David and I have a daughter in Uganda who's dealing with one of those guys who's been in place for 40 years. And he was a great Democrat, but over time he became, a great dictator. And that is the path that could have happened here. Sure, write a bunch of great words like liberté, égalité, fraternité, and then look and see how many people of color and low-income people are in France's most awesome universities. No, because the liberté, égalité, fraternité never moved into the people in that great country. They were in monarchies for 2,000 years almost. Why would they suddenly snap? They didn't. They never had the continuity that this country achieved. Having been subjects, when that document was signed, the struggle began to turn us into living like citizens, and that would be a different kind of life. So let me talk to you a bit about the way that transition happened. The founders understood that they would, in signing this document, be establishing opportunities for free enterprise and wealth building to occur at a rate that would develop an economy that would be stronger than the economies of England and France and the various European countries, with which, as you know, we had more than one subsequent war, including the War of 1812, which you all remember from 6th grade. No test after my speech. So if we didn't get stronger than they would send an army and take us back, and we'd be subjects again. So they knew they were going to have to build a strong economy. They knew there would have to be a flourishing of the entrepreneurial activities that had gone on in the colonies before 1776. But several, in fact, a contingent of the founders were very deeply schooled in philosophy, and they had read that democracy does not perdure in the absence of virtue in the people. Because democracy depends on the citizens being willing to make sacrifices for each other. And if I have much more money than you and I'm anxious to wipe out your company in open and free competition and get richer, the richer I get, the more I might want to throw you and your family overboard. That makes it hard for us to be citizens in the civic context. So there's a real push-pull in the pressures to build a highly competitive entrepreneurial economy and to maintain virtue in the people, civic virtues, which operate in a relationship to the religious or spiritual virtues that the great Judeo-Christian traditions we emerged from have taught for thousands of years. So what do you do? And several of the founders said in 3 generations, there could be a small group of people who become an aristocracy, and then a king would emerge. And we'd be back to a monarchy in 3 generations. What do we do? No human beings had ever figured that out. And they asked themselves, who could make this happen? And interestingly, they determined that the answer was a mother. And there were actual discussions and decisions made to ask women to raise the children of the Republic who would have civic virtues taught to them from their tiniest time at their mother's knee. And they would grow up with an understanding of what it would take to be a citizen. And who else could teach than the people who spent the most time with little kids? And there are documents that show how women were being asked to raise daughters who would not tolerate men as lovers and husbands, who were not full of what was truly called Republican virtues. That is, people whose personal character would sustain the Republic. They could personally balance wealth building and generosity, compassion, independence and interdependence, self-reliance and desire to invest in the well-being of others. You get my drift. This was going to be people who understood Aristotle's golden mean right from their tiniest days. And if daughters raised children like that because their husbands were like that, the other kinds of men would die out. And that meant which is fine because they weren't going to help the Republic, so their absence wouldn't be missed. And then they were to raise men who would grow up from the earliest times with that sense of character, commitment to ethics, but not just airy-fairy ethics that you read about in books, the real live decisions about how to make your company work in this wonderful way that Tocqueville noticed called self-interest rightly understood, which means, and it still works today, it is in my interest to make sure that I do well and that you do as well as I can enable you to do, because that's going to mean that our children and grandchildren are going to be safe. And if you're fighting only for your own next 8 years or 12 years or 30 years, and that's the end, well, you're not going to sustain a republic, so we kind of all don't care if you succeed or not. But if we're embedded in each other's success, yes, we're competitive, but self-interest rightly understood means that there are only so many things I'll do, to outdo your company. And then there are limits. And there are only so many things that we'll do from our sector before it starts to impinge on the well-being of the other sectors in society. If we're not all together as citizens, this isn't going to work. So Americans have had these civic virtues called to attention in society from the very days that the ink was still wet on the Great Declaration. When we think about that, we think about what that's done in our society and how it is that we have the only market economy like it in the world. And whether China has a bigger economy someday, which it has to since it has 3 times the number of people and probably 6 times the square mileage, how can it be otherwise? But is that going to redefine things? No, because size doesn't matter first. No one, and especially not China, will have the quality of character in citizens and therefore the aggregate commitment to a set of principles that are life-sustaining that we have, unless, of course, we forget about them, which sometimes seems like it would be possible, which is why we're all here today, you and me. So what has made this economy so strong? Yes, the entrepreneurial energy. Yes, the inventiveness. Yes, the space in government to actually be free enough to operate. But what we have in our society is what I call a virtuous cycle that generosity brings to our economy. And it creates an invigorating force in our economy. And if you haven't thought of the nonprofit sector or the social profit sector and philanthropy as an energizer bunny at the core of American economy, let me take you there. Now, in front of me, without my falling over, is a clock, a huge clock, okay? Here is 12 o'clock, here is 3 o'clock, here's 6 o'clock, and here is 9 o'clock. Are you with me? Okay. You're a wealthy person, or a well-to-do citizen, and you have some money to invest. And so you decide that you are going to give a scholarship to the University of Arkansas. And you do. And the young person who gets that scholarship comes from a community that itself is thrilled for that young person. And that young person has received a gift of generosity. And that gift of generosity has created opportunity. And it's not just opportunity for that young person. It's opportunity for his family and his community and the other kinds of attachments he's made, right? And so the gift of generosity creates opportunity. And that opportunity creates wealth, it creates development, it creates the next generation for prosperity. So generosity, opportunity, prosperity. He goes home to that village or may stay in the capital, and his work or her work is transforming because of your investment. So now we're at prosperity. Now there are all kinds of possibilities that are existing that wouldn't have been possible because that young person might have done something in the community that would have been lovely but not transformative, would have been a couple of steps off where his parents were. And all over the world, people are lucky if they get that much chance. But here, because of generosity, our nation is different. We look around us for chances to create self-interest rightly understood. Generosity, opportunity, prosperity. And the prosperity that that person realizes he's experiencing says what to him? I need to give back, exactly. So now that sense of prosperity creates a clarity around gratitude. I was a college president for 13 years, and our scholarship students would stand up and talk to the luncheon of their donors. Maybe some of you have been at events like this. And the first thing they say, you don't have to prompt them, is, someday I want to be able to do what all of you have done. I'm so grateful. I never could have. And then what do they want to do? They want to do it. So that terrific experience of prosperity you didn't know you would have turns into gratitude. And when you're grateful, you want to give back. And so you're back to generosity. Generosity, opportunity, prosperity, gratitude, generosity. Do you get the energy that comes as people are entering society all the time and making the economy move? People who would never have achieved at the levels that they could impact the economy in another country do here. And we often hear the phrase, only in America, only in America. That didn't happen by mistake. It happened because people designed the credo of what we believe that would energize wealth building and balance it with virtue building. And that machine would create this asset of maximizing human capital, which is, according to Gary Becker, who won a Nobel Prize in 1974 for this work, Gary Becker said in his research that human capital comprises 75% of a nation's wealth, of a community's wealth. So any poor people in your community are wealth no one has invested in and made come 10 times its size in asset. Sometimes even wonderful spiritual people look at poverty and they say, didn't he say something like, poverty you shall have always with you? I remember that. So our foundation is going to work on this piece, and the rest of the poverty, you know. Well, I would like you to hear me reinterpreting the great master, and that is, he didn't mean poor people would be always with you. He meant poverty, right? And many of us are desperately poor in imagination. Lots of us are from time to time very poor in generosity of spirit. And if you're poor in imagination and in generosity, maybe you're also sometimes poor in inventiveness, in an innovative spirit. In other words, there's poverty of the spirit. And here this weeping woman who poured the oil on Christ's feet and dried it with her hair, She was generous in spirit. She was generous in imagination. And he said, the poor you shall have always with you, meaning people who are poorer than she is in imagination and generosity. And let her do what she's doing, right? And let people follow her in being ebullient, in sharing or giving away the best she has. That's to tell me I have 2 more minutes. It's to stop me from talking to you for 50 minutes, which is an academic lecture, so you don't know what you've been spared. So my point here is that we can passively, and not even realizing that in our 7-year-old brain that we came home from church with, we can have a statement that can kind of make it okay to do the palliation. You know, when we do the social sector palliative care, where we don't expect anything to really change, but we're going to help out a little. That's hospice. And if the nonprofits you're connected to are doing hospice care, that's better than nothing. But I'd like you to think what would happen if you decided that you're going to look at the patients, the clients, and say, you know what? I heard other words in those sermons. I heard, arise and walk. I heard, Lazarus, come out. He didn't just sit there and grieve with Martha and Mary, right? So I'm telling you that we could all be the people we are and do what we're doing and change our mentality. Think back to what the Declaration says. If your version says most men are created equal and most men are endowed with the unalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, you got a bad copy. And if you thought that poverty had to always be with us, so some people in the bottom 15% of the United States are living with 3 times the rate of infant mortality as the people in the middle-income families, those little guys had no access to life. Liberty and the pursuit of happiness were icing on a cake they never got because they didn't live past their first birthday. Is that okay? Is it all right for us to have a pocket of 15% of us who have twice the rate of maternal death in childbirth? If you put the well-being statistics, which are called human development statistics, if you're an important person in the field, which I'm not, but it's called human development. And if you put the human development statistics of Americans, mostly white, many African Americans and people from other backgrounds, if you put them together as a group, their human development statistics make them look like they are a third world country. And if you took them out of the US statistics and made believe that we weren't responsible for them and they didn't count, God forbid, then US statistics would move up the line of the comparative human development statistics, where we are now in most of those areas, number 23, 22, 26 out of the 28 developed countries that are rated by the United Nations. Can you imagine that our country would be 23rd on things like infant mortality and maternal death and childbirth? See, that's not all right. But because most of us, 85% of us, live in an amazing condition, you know, and then we're working with that battered women's group, aren't we? And I'm doing good work. And you are. But it's like not big picture. And if we could take those people out of our numbers, the US would be in number 1 or 2 in all the categories. Now, I don't know about all of you, but it makes me, as the daughter of a World War II fighter pilot over Japan who was shot down and spent time in a Japanese prison camp, I feel badly to let my country sink there, even if I didn't care desperately about the lives being lived in sorrow and suffering by the bottom 15%. Even if I didn't care, for my daddy, I'd say, you know what, that's not good enough to have us down there. We've got to fix this. And you know what? There are 265 million of us living in the 85%, and 45 million living in the bottom 15%. And I am starting an initiative to gang up on the 15% and ask if they would work with us as Americans to understand how to say, stand up and walk, or Lazarus, come out, and change their settings so that they would have the same percentage of infant mortality incidences as middle-income families have. That's not a financial issue. That's an imagination and education issue that we could change, but we haven't set our minds to it. And it's not that we're not doing wonderful things all over the nation. And please don't stop while you're thinking about it. But what I'm saying to you is, given who we are and who we have been, couldn't we change things? So here's the kicker, and then I'll stop. I think that we Americans now, of diverse ages, we ought to say that between 2011 and 2026, July 4th to be exact, which is the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, we're going to celebrate that 250th being able to say 100% of our fellow Americans really have access to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Because one day, in 2011, we decided to really listen to the last words of the Declaration, which are the following, and called us in 2011 to 15 years of work to make the words of the Declaration really true for everybody. Those words are, to achieve this nation under the protection of divine providence, we pledge each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. We can do this if the 85% of us stand up and say, I know what other generations have done, and my generation, our generation, is going to be looked at in the future as the even greater generation. Thank you, and God bless you.
Thank you. We do have time for a couple of questions. If you raise your hand, we'll get a microphone to you.
Hi, thank you so much for sharing with us. I was really intrigued about learning about how in our founding we really sought to nurture these civil values. And I was hoping you could talk a little bit about how we can use philanthropy or generosity in general to address our society in a transformative way.
Right. Thank you. Well, first of all, America has gotten to where it is by little platoons, Edmund Burke, of people working at the grassroots, making everything happen. Even Microsoft and the current fabulous stuff happening in democracy, you know, it's happening in garages. It's little groups of us working together. And we have to get back to that. I appreciate all the institutions that all of us belong to, but if they silo us from each other, then it's not working. People didn't have all these institutions years ago. There weren't boards of directors doing important things and only giving to the things under our mission statement because we're modern. Well, great. But most of the great thinkers and doers were working in little communities on things they knew had to happen. So I believe that this kind of a movement, and I actually have a staff now and startup money, so I'm really serious. And if you want to be involved, make my day. The spelling of my last name, you'll find my website, and this movement is called the Declaration Initiative. And this book, which I was given a splendid year by a set of fabulous people to go off and write, so I didn't have to do anything else, 15 hours a day, weekends as well, tells the story of why it should happen and lays out how it should happen. But it happens from communities that decide to work together and say, we all do some different things, all of them are good, but suppose we wanted to eradicate what I call the fatal disparities between the bottom 15 in life and the middle American statistics. We're not going to make everybody equally wealthy. But you don't have to be wealthy to deliver a healthy baby. And you don't have to be wealthy to know how to talk to it so that it arrives at kindergarten with a decent number of words. People in the community can have worked with that young mother who may be fourth generation foster child. She doesn't know how to raise a baby so that the baby can speak well at age 4. But if that baby hasn't heard 30 million more words than a baby in the bottom 15% hears, that baby is not going to read by 9. Babies born into the bottom 15% of our population hear 30 million fewer words than a baby born into a middle American family. Now we're going to ask a teacher to bring that kid up to a reading level by age 9? Yeah, right. And a child in America who does not read by age 9 is walking a plank. And all of us, with all the good things we're doing, we're watching. Because we know these statistics. They're in the field. Look it up online. Just put in reading by 9 and you'll be inundated. There'll be 150,000 entries. And it'll tell you the story. Those kids have 7 and 8 times the rate of teenage pregnancy. They have 10 times the rate of incarceration. People in the bottom 15% live 25% fewer years. People in middle-income America live about 75, 76 years on average. People in the bottom 15% are dead by 50. These are the statistics where all of America was in 1910. They're a century behind us. Is that okay? Would you like a key to your Lexus or your fabulous new Taurus or whatever the cars are? And knowing that there's 15%, get my drift? So it's communities. You know in this community where your poorest people are. I know where my poorest people are in New York. And we all know, and I'm saying, what if we blew the socks off the rest of the world and community by community we said, let's say by July 4th, 2012, we had enough of the nation together to say, this nation is going to try to get its bottom 15% out of the human development statistics they're locked into, and to a point where they can grab the brass ring of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We could make that happen. And we could also just kind of bobble along. But other people will watch us say that in the teeth of this great recession, we decided to take on something crazy, like the people did in the midst of the Great Depression when they said we're going to end polio. Or another group of people in the South said we're going to stop hookworm, which was destabilizing and destroying lives of all kinds of people. And they said, in 5 years, we're going to eradicate hookworm. And everybody said, you're nuts. And of course, they did it because they're Americans. We're a different kind of Homo sapiens here. Sir.
Come behind you.
Thank you. Welcome to the Clinton School. I'm moved by your invocation of both Thomas Jefferson, John Dewey, Jeremy Rifkin et al., maybe even Bernie Sanders, who's arguing that we need a surtax.
That's right. Bless his heart.
So one has to be careful.
Edmund Burke as well.
Of course.
We've got the whole group.
sort of having suffered through some philanthropy, and particularly around educational issues, I'm struck by a couple of issues that worry me.
Okay.
First of all, I'm absolutely embrace your notion of reminding what the purpose of education in a democracy is for, which is to sustain and enrich a democracy. It's something that's completely, in my mind, lost in how what Mike Rose talks about, how we talk about schooling.
That's
we don't invoke that purpose anymore.
That's
in fact,
particularly professors.
Exactly. And although I was wonderful enough in my own experience to have mentorships from both John Goodlad and Ted Sizer, who lived their entire lives in that, but they've been marginalized. We invoke a nation at risk while forgetting the work they've done. What I wanted to sort of riff on a little bit is this notion of repurposing for civic virtue, but also to make problematic the role of philanthropy in this. I mean, if you look, the Gates Foundation and all of their brethren are really invoking, in my mind, a new instrumentalism. They've all embraced the new role of national standards, which really suggests that there's some knowledge more important than others. We talk about benchmarking with countries like Finland and Singapore. When we forget what they do, there is no family poverty in many of those countries. So the incongruity, if you will, the inconsistency on one hand of invoking this, we have to compete in a global economy. Specifically, I think, this is around the standards-based stuff, which really invokes the role of what I think is one of the most undemocratic and perhaps even more dangerous immoral practices of making judgments with psychometrics, with tests. And we see these foundations, perhaps even some in Arkansas, that continue to reify, to cement this notion that this is the best way to make judgments about performance, about human development, as you say. So in some ways, on one hand, you hear Bill Gates and Melinda Gates, wonderful work they're doing, but it could well be that they're actually cementing what I hear as some of your great fear. And so how in the world does one counter the enormous wealth and power of Bill Gates and Melinda Gates? They have completely funded the New Standards Project at the national level, which automatically suggests some knowledge is more important than others. And so we go back to this instrumentalism. So I'm not really optimistic about the role of philanthropy. In fact, what if they discover that we've completely re-separated our democracy and that we've, again, relegated the democratic impulses and purposes of our educational system to something much more instrumental?
That's just a brilliant, of course, question, and you knew that when you asked it, which was really unkind. But the rest of you have to live with him, so I won't get too upset. But no, seriously, thank you. Let me say that you're bringing up a piece of, a much more important piece of something I just slightly mentioned by saying a lot of foundations have gotten over that business of responding to amazing entrepreneurs who come in from their community with a great idea to attend to such and such because they have their mission statement. And I'm really sorry, but this doesn't fit right within our mission statement. So what people are doing is using benchmarking and standards, all of which have a role, if they're used with love and compassion and imagination. If they're used as a way of easily going through grants and saying, we don't have to look at these because they're not mission-proof, then that's an abuse of the notion of mission. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, I'm optimistic because I think Mother Teresa was right. You save souls one at a time, and you engage people, I know this is totally hokey, by loving them, not by administering to them. The nuns who taught me were very tough, but they loved us so much, and they wanted us to be able to be good women. And they were willing to have me angry at them momentarily until I grew up another year, and then I'd go back to Sister Rose and say, remember the day you made me throw my favorite pink comb in the garbage because I wasn't supposed to be combing my hair during class, which I had just gotten a new hairdo and I wanted to just smooth it down. I had these curls and I'd gotten, anyway. And I could tell her, you know, you helped me remember that I ought to be focused on what I'm doing. And I could tell her that a few years later, but at the time, we have to love people and engage with them. They told us and explained to us and listened to us, and they loved us. If we've gotten so bureaucratic that everything is done according to, who grew up in a house like that as a happy child? People looked at you and loved you, and they wanted to hear why you needed such and such. And then you could explain why they couldn't have it because it was right before dinner. My little grandson explained when he was 1.5 years to his mother that 2 was more than 1, and he'd like 2 candies before dinner. And she had to explain to him that, you know, but she did that lovingly and distracted him and did a story with him. We're not engaging with the poor. We're much more worried about what other people up here think about us than how we're going to go to sleep at night and maybe, in my view, meet our maker someday. And we're not going to be asked, I don't think, how tight was your mission statement? We're going to be asked, how did you love them? I sent you people who loved you, and you had a huge amount of education and opportunity, and you ended up working through such structures that you never saw they were there to be loved. So when I talk to you about community, I'm talking to you about calling out the members of the poorest communities and learning, and there are people who really know how to do this, and my partner in the Declaration Initiative is a spectacular senior African-American woman whom some of you may have heard of, Lynetta Gilbert. I know our spectacular Charisse knows her well. But when you talk to her about how to come to understand how to listen in community as an outsider, you realize, at least I did, you know, that sounds a lot like the way my grandmother used to talk to her grandchildren. And I was one of the younger ones of her grandchildren. And, you know, she could have gotten me to do anything because of the way she listened to us as well as told us stories. Where are the stories? We give people benchmarks. So I'm not, you know, I've been a college president. I ran a $90 million budget. I'm on a corporate board on Wall Street. I really do understand and appreciate the structures, and we have to have them to run companies, to run businesses, and to run schools, to run academic departments. I understand. I don't want you to think that, you know, David and I hang around in grass skirts and sing Kumbaya all day. Wrong. But I'm telling you that along with all of the strong things we've learned to do, if we have forgotten loving in community and investing in people because we love them, then of course it's not going to work. But then we start to look more and more like other economies. You know, the communist countries had a great planned economy. Oh, mother, was it planned. It didn't work, but it was planned, right? No. We have to learn how to integrate the two. And what I'm telling you today is our great history was born before all of the capacity to do the kind of structuring and bureaucracy and planning we're doing now. So what if we were smart enough to integrate the two? I'm not saying pitch it. I'm saying integrate it. Use it imaginatively. There is special knowledge that is specially important to know. If you want to be a physicist and you decide that I can, you know, that you can just learn anything you want and turn out able to, or to be a pediatrician, that's just poppycock. You can also read poetry. And my sister and brother were both English majors in college, but they're both premier physicians. One a cardiovascular surgeon and the other a double board certified endocrinologist, but they were English majors. So I'm not, you know, you got to put the two together, and we're smart enough to do this now. And if this kind of Southern loving, highly organized, transformational thinking could happen first from Arkansas, from you who know so much and have a state that's small enough and may I say intimate enough and well organized enough that you could pull it off, Suppose the state that got there first and that initiated this with the most energy, where people were coming from Massachusetts to find out how the heck you were making this much progress. Would that be cool? It would be amazing. But if you don't leap to that kind of an imagination, it's not just, you're all going to hate me now, it's not just enough to be like better than Tennessee. No. Or better than Mississippi. No. You could lead the nation. You know how to do this. You're already doing a lot of it. It's just a matter of fine-tuning. And you know, if you don't fine-tune some machines, they're utterly worthless. You can build it, you can set it up, and if it's not fine-tuned, it doesn't work at all. And you've got a great machine. So I know that you, Nikolai is looking at me with fire in his eyes. I know that you all need to be let free, but I warmly invite you to be in touch with me. I don't get a royalty for this. The great people who were kind enough to set me up to write this said, here's your asset, go write this puppy, and that's it. So I'm not telling you to buy it because I will get 53 cents. It's a book that will tell you some of the deeper history that I told you. Some great stories that you want to be able to take to the boards you're on and the fellow citizens you're working with. It'll give you a way of thinking about the Declaration. Some of the things, as I was doing the research, I know it sounds corny, but now that you know me a little better, you won't be surprised. I would cry. I would sit there and say, I didn't know this. How could I be 66 and not know this? And you just sit there and say, you know, but now that I know it, I'm going to try to tell everybody. So that stuff is in here. The middle of it deals with what state legislatures and people in government ought to know about how to keep philanthropy free to do its work. We need to work on inspiration and innovation, not intrusive legislation. We've always done our best work when people said, here's a problem that probably nobody can solve. And then we all look at each other with squinty eyes and say, he doesn't realize what it is to be an American, does he? And we get to work, and we make the world different. So that's your assignment. The end of it actually lays out the Declaration Initiative stuff, and I think we can do this, and I think we will have a fabulous July 4th, 2026, when we can shoot off the fireworks and pack the house with red, white, and blue bunting and say, that assignment pad that those guys with funny hairdos gave us, we completed our capstone in 2026. It only took us 250 years, but we were doing a few other things. Thank you, and God bless you.